A king lies motionless. The chamber is stiflingly warm, though not from the desert air outside. No breeze dares move the heavy drapes. The braziers have long since been extinguished, but the room still hums with heat. Flies tap at the edges of bronze bowls filled with fruit now half rotted. In the middle of this motionless scene lies a man whose name the world still whispers. Alexander, the conqueror of kings, the man who erased empires and redrew maps with a sword, the one who claimed to be the son of Zeus, and made others believe it too. But now, in the fading light of a Babylonian palace, this god-king is very much mortal. His chest rises only slightly. His eyes, when they open, see no one. His lips part, but no words emerge. He has not spoken in days. And soon, he won't speak again. You probably won't sleep soundly after this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins not with a battle, but with silence, the silence of a man who cannot speak, the silence of a court too frightened to admit what's happening, the silence before the collapse of a world-spanning dream. Alexander the Great lies dying. At just 32 years old, he has conquered more of the known world than anyone before him, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the edges of India. And yet, all that power, all that glory, cannot stop whatever is now ravaging his body. The year is 323 BCE. Babylon, in modern-day Iraq, is his capital of the moment. It's a place of wealth, temples, canals, and superstition. The stars here don't just twinkle, they dictate policy. And lately, they've been giving off ominous signals. A lunar eclipse just a few days earlier has spooked the priests. 2 royal lion cubs were born and died on the same day. Bad omens, very bad. And now, their king is falling. No one knows exactly when it begins. Some say it starts with a chill, a shiver over wine. Others say it's a sharp pain in the gut, just after a feast. But what's consistent is what follows, a slow unraveling. He can no longer rise from bed. His limbs weaken, his voice softens. Fever clutches him like a jealous lover and refuses to let go. Mainstream historians agree on at least this. Alexander fell seriously ill in early June of 323 BCE. During a stay in Babylon's palace, possibly the same one that once belonged to Nebuchadnezzar. They also agree that the illness lasted about 10 to 12 days. That's where the consensus ends. Because this isn't just the story of a death, it's the story of a mystery. There's no wound, no battlefield, no assassin leaping from behind a curtain. Just a man slowly breaking apart from within. And a court full of powerful people with a lot to lose, and maybe a lot to gain. Let's talk about that court. At Alexander's side are his generals, men like Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, all of whom will carve out pieces of his empire once he's gone. There's also Roxana, his young Persian wife, pregnant with what may be his only male heir. There are advisors, astrologers, priests, physicians, and servants. Too many eyes. Too many hands, and yet no one seems able, or willing, to stop what's happening. Some will later claim that no one truly believed he would die. That they assumed, like always, he'd recover. After all, this is a man who took an arrow to the lung and kept fighting. Who crossed deserts, faced elephants, and laughed off omens. But this time, there is no miracle comeback, only deterioration. He loses the ability to move. His eyes grow cloudy, his speech disappears. Some sources say he was lucid, others insist he was delirious. In one version, he hands his signet ring to Perdiccas, hinting at a successor. In another, he murmurs something about handing power to the strongest, which is exactly the kind of vague thing that causes a century of war. And all the while, the fever climbs. There's a lesser-known detail tucked into some ancient accounts. Even as Alexander lay dying, he allegedly insisted on being propped up so he could watch his soldiers file past his bedside. One by one, they marched through the chamber in silence, eyes fixed on the floor, pretending not to notice that their king, this so-called son of Zeus, was dying in front of them. It's theatrical, tragic, and a little eerie, like a funeral happening before the corpse has cooled. Historians still argue whether this procession actually took place, or if it's just a poetic flourish added later by writers hungry for symbolism. But it fits the tone of what comes next: confusion, secrecy, and slow-motion catastrophe. Because in a kingdom ruled by one man's charisma, one man's vision, the moment he goes still, everything else begins to shake. And here's where things get more suspicious. Despite the importance of what's happening, we don't have a single first-hand account. All the sources we rely on, Plutarch, Arrian, Curtius Rufus, are writing centuries later. They're working from memories, rumors, and maybe a few surviving documents. There's no hospital chart, no autopsy, just layers of stories on top of stories. Some say poison, some say malaria, others claim divine punishment. But here's something even more unsettling, according to several ancient writers. Alexander's body didn't decompose for 6 full days after his death. That's not just strange, it's practically supernatural. The Egyptians took it as proof that he was a god. The Greeks, depending on the region, saw it as either sacred or suspicious. Modern medicine, of course, offers alternatives. Maybe the body was embalmed quickly. Maybe it was stored in a cool chamber. Or, this one's chilling, maybe he wasn't actually dead yet. Yes, there's a theory that Alexander was in a coma, paralyzed, muted, alive, a victim of some rare condition, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, that made him appear dead while he could still hear, feel, and think. Imagine that. Imagine being trapped in your own body, aware that the world has declared you gone, that your generals are plotting, that your wife is weeping, that your soldiers are filing past like mourners. And you can't move, you can't scream, you can only listen. True or not, it's a detail that haunts this story like a shadow. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, reduced to a breath, a blink, a silence. And yet, even as his body stills, the intrigue begins to stir. The wine, the pain, the fire. It starts, they say, with a cup of wine. Not just any wine. This is Babylonian hospitality at its finest. Thick, sweet, heady stuff, served in a crater large enough to bathe in. It's late in the evening, maybe early June, and Alexander is feasting, laughing, surrounded by his generals. The war is over, for now, and the empire is his. What could possibly go wrong? He drinks, then groans, then doubles over. That's the moment where everything begins to unravel. Some say it was a stabbing pain in his side. Others say it was like a flame in his belly, spreading. He staggers. He tries to stand and can't. And though it's passed off at first as a passing illness, within hours, everyone in the palace is whispering the same terrible word: poison. It's almost too obvious. A young king at the height of his powers. A goblet. A sudden collapse. But here's where the story splits in 20 directions. Mainstream historians have long debated this moment. The wine incident is recorded in several ancient sources, including the often dramatic writings of Justin and Diodorus Siculus. It plays like the opening scene of a murder mystery. But was it really poison? Or something worse? Before we answer that, let's rewind slightly. Alexander had spent the last several years marching east, conquering Persia, storming into India, and pushing his army to the edge of exhaustion. By the time he returns west to Babylon, his body is battered. He's suffered dozens of wounds, arrows, swords, infections. He's also been drinking heavily, mourning close friends, and possibly battling a fever even before this banquet. And the wine? That might just be the trigger, not the cause. There's a quirky detail in the ancient texts that many overlook. The wine was offered by a man named Medius of Larissa, one of Alexander's companions and known for hosting loud, late-night drinking parties. In fact, the evening he fell ill, Alexander had been attending one of Medius's gatherings. Did Medius mean harm, or was it just another night of excess? Historians still argue whether the wine was poisoned, or whether Alexander was already ill, and the wine simply hastened the symptoms. Let's entertain the poison theory for a moment. The list of suspects would stretch from here to Persia. First, Antipater, the regent of Macedon, left behind in Greece. Alexander had summoned him to Babylon, possibly to reprimand or replace him. Instead, Antipater sent his son, Cassander, in his place, who would later be accused of poisoning the king with a slow-acting substance hidden in a mule's hoof. Yes, really. Then there's the old-school theory that Aristotle, may have helped concoct the poison as revenge for the execution of his nephew. Feels a bit far-fetched. But if you're a conspiracy theorist with a fondness for ancient drama, it's catnip. But there's a big problem. Ancient poisons, especially in that era, worked fast, not over 11 days, and that's where the poison theory begins to fall apart. Instead, modern scholars propose a range of medical possibilities: typhoid fever, pancreatitis, malaria, or even West Nile virus. The symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, progressive weakness, could fit many things. Typhoid is a popular candidate, especially since Babylon's canals were notoriously unhygienic. But let's not forget, perception matters more than reality. To the people around him, it looked like a curse, a betrayal, a punishment, and the timing couldn't be worse. Alexander had just returned from a long journey east. He'd pushed his troops into India, faced war elephants, nearly drowned in monsoon floods, and then had to drag a disgruntled army back through the Gadrosian Desert, an infamous march that cost thousands of lives. His soldiers were tired, his generals were testy, and now he was trying to reassert control by planning more campaigns, possibly into Arabia. Not everyone was thrilled about that. The mood at court had shifted. One lesser-known moment from this time comes from a Babylonian astronomical diary, a real clay tablet kept by local priests. It records ominous celestial events in the days surrounding Alexander's death: eclipses, odd planetary alignments, even dreams interpreted as warnings. In the ancient world, such signs weren't shrugged off, they were taken as divine verdicts. Imagine being a Macedonian officer, already disillusioned by your king's obsession with Persian customs, watching him slip into silence while priests mutter about omens. Would you intervene? Would you help? Or would you wait? And maybe hope? Here's something chilling. While Alexander lies sick, his inner circle does nothing. They don't announce the illness. They don't summon a successor. They don't even open the palace doors for several days. They just wait. Some later claimed they feared causing panic. Others suspected they were buying time, either to jostle for power or, more cynically, to make sure he didn't recover. Because if Alexander recovered, he might remember who stayed and who slipped away. A less publicized detail appears in the Romance of Alexander, a semi-legendary account that blends history with myth. In it, there's mention of Alexander's body becoming cold in the limbs but hot in the head. His physicians try everything: herbs, oils, charms. Nothing works. And in the background, the succession crisis quietly begins to crack open. No heir, no will, just a sprawling empire bound together by one man's charisma, and now that man is fading like smoke. Back to that wine. If it wasn't poison, it may have simply been the last indulgence of a man whose body was already on fire from within. A tipping point, a last toast before the collapse. And still, there's that unsettling detail: for 6 days after he was pronounced dead, his body showed no decay, no bloat, no discoloration. The priests noted it, the soldiers whispered about it. The embalming team, one assumes, waited nervously. To some, it was proof of divinity. To others, proof that they'd made a mistake. Was Alexander poisoned? Did he die of a fever? Or did he die later? Lying still, unblinking, hearing every whispered plan, history has chosen not to answer. But the wine was only the beginning. The 11 days of silence. The body does not rot. That's the first thing everyone notices. 6 days pass, then 7, then 11, and still, no smell, no bloating, no signs that Alexander the Great, beloved of Ammon, conqueror of worlds, son of Zeus, is decaying like a mortal man should. The heat in Babylon is no joke. This is the edge of the Mesopotamian summer. And yet, the corpse remains pristine. To some, this is divine proof. Alexander was no ordinary man. He was a god, and the gods do not rot. To others, particularly those with a more pragmatic bent, it's suspicious. Not divine, not miraculous, just strange. Historians still argue whether this so-called miracle actually happened, or whether, more disturbingly, it means Alexander wasn't dead yet. Yes, you heard that right. Some medical historians have suggested that Alexander may have suffered from a rare neurological condition, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, that could have left him completely paralyzed, unable to move, speak, or react, yet still alive and conscious. A terrifying thought, trapped in a body, watching the world decide your fate, unable to scream, and for 11 days, the world waits. The palace becomes a pressure cooker. Alexander's generals, the most powerful men in the known world, are gathering in tense, hushed meetings. They're not praying for his recovery. They're debating what comes next. You see, Alexander left no clear heir. There's a half-brother, Aridius, technically the son of Philip II, but he's mentally disabled and not considered fit to rule. There's also Alexander's wife, Roxana, a Sogdian noblewoman who's pregnant, but the child hasn't been born yet, and no one knows whether it'll be a boy. That leaves a wide, bloody vacuum. The army is restless. The Persian satraps, local governors installed by Alexander during his conquests, are nervous. And the Macedonian generals? They're sharpening knives, metaphorically and literally. One quirky, often overlooked detail from this time, the Babylonian priests, who had been tracking Alexander's illness alongside the omens, begin to record disturbances in the palace. Unusual noise, arguments, marching boots at strange hours. Things are happening behind closed doors. Let's rewind slightly again. On the day Alexander reportedly lost his voice, he still made one final gesture. He handed his signet ring to his friend and general, Perdiccas. Was it a sign of succession? Of trust? Or simply the closest hand he could reach? Perdiccas certainly takes it that way. Almost immediately, he begins consolidating power, quietly, carefully. After all, if Alexander dies, and that seems increasingly likely, someone has to step into the breach. The term diadoschwa will be coined later, successors. But in these 11 days, the word doesn't exist yet. There's no plan, no council, just a ring, a rumor, a rattling breath behind a door no one dares to open. And Babylon begins to hold its breath. What's extraordinary is how paralyzed everyone becomes. No one declares a new king. No one sends word to the provinces. The soldiers camped outside the palace are fed vague updates. The king is unwell, but recovering. Then, the king is resting. Then, silence. Inside, the inner circle fractures. Some push for a regency until Roxana gives birth. Others argue that Aridius should rule. Despite his limitations, after all, he has royal blood and can be controlled. Still others whisper of carving up the empire entirely, letting each general rule a portion. This is the beginning of what will become a 40-year bloodbath. But right now, in the heat-soaked halls of Babylon, all is whispers and tension. There's a brief moment, recorded in the royal journals, a now lost document cited by later historians, when Alexander, though speechless, supposedly greets his soldiers. They file past him in his chamber, silent and tearful, and he acknowledges them with his eyes. It's poetic, maybe apocryphal, but powerful. Even if it didn't happen, the fact that people believed it did says something. Even dying, perhaps already dead, Alexander commands reverence, fear, loyalty, and uncertainty. Another scholarly debate centers on the palace records from this time. The official Babylonian chronicle notes a delay between Alexander's last known breath and the embalming process. That gap is hard to explain unless one of two things is true. Either the priests were stunned and slow to act, or they weren't sure he was actually gone. And while the generals argue, Roxana makes a bold move. She calls for the murder of Statera, one of Alexander's other wives, the daughter of Darius III, the Persian king. She's a political rival, and Roxana knows that when it comes to royal succession, dead wives don't bear inconvenient sons. It's a dark, quiet murder, likely carried out with chilling efficiency. That's the kind of palace Babylon has become. Meanwhile, outside, the people are starting to suspect something's wrong. No appearances, no proclamations, just flickering torches, tightly sealed doors, and a growing sense that the king inside might not be kinging anymore. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the psychological weight here. Alexander had styled himself a living god, a second Achilles, a bridge between East and West. He had reshaped the known world in less than a decade. And now, Suddenly, wordlessly, he's gone. No fanfare, no hero's death in battle. Just a sick room, and the most powerful men on earth standing around, not sure what to do. There's a strange irony here. For all his brilliance, Alexander never planned for succession. He built an empire on charisma, conquest, and personal bonds. But empires need institutions, orders, blueprints, and he left none. Instead, he leaves behind a single, chilling quote. According to one tradition, when asked on his deathbed to whom he leaves his empire, Alexander whispers, "To the strongest." Whether he ever said that is debatable, but the men around him certainly take it to heart. The 11 days of silence will end. The corpse will eventually be embalmed. The empire will fracture like glass. But right now, it's still, breathless, waiting, as if the world itself is unsure whether to grieve or draw swords. The funeral that never came. The king is dead. Long live, who, exactly? As Babylon stirs back to life after those 11 agonizing days, one might expect a grand royal funeral, something on the scale of a god-emperor whose shadow touched 3 continents. Instead, what happens is nothing. Not for a while, and then, something very, very strange. Alexander's body does not burn. It does not rest in the earth. It does not ascend in ceremony amid weeping crowds and fluttering banners. Instead, it becomes an object, a prize, a pawn in a much bigger game. Historians still argue whether this was part of some larger plan or a product of chaos. Either way, what follows isn't a funeral. It's a tug of war. The embalming itself is worth pausing on. Ancient sources claim that Egyptian embalmers were summoned. Some say they used honey. Others claim they bathed his body in a golden sarcophagus filled with exotic oils and spices. The goal? Preserve the flesh perfectly, indefinitely. And they do a shockingly good job. When Alexander's body is eventually moved, witnesses centuries later would describe it as eerily lifelike, skin supple, limbs intact, eyes half-lidded as though merely asleep. One quirky little detail. Some later Roman writers believed Alexander had been placed in a crystal coffin. That's probably not true, but the fact that people imagined it gives you a sense of the myth forming already. But here's the kicker. There's no funeral because no one can agree who gets to bury him. Remember that deathbed whisper, "To the strongest"? It might as well have been a match tossed onto dry timber. Perdiccas, the general who received Alexander's signet ring, tries to act as regent. He sides with Roxana and the unborn child, attempting to preserve the illusion of continuity. Meanwhile, other generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, are already calculating angles. They smell the opportunity of empire. And nothing screams legitimacy like being the one to bury Alexander the Great. There's a reason medieval kings spent more time planning their tombs than their wars. Burial is power. Burial is narrative control. Whoever places Alexander in the ground, wherever that ground may be, can claim a connection to the divine. So Perdiccas commissions an enormous funeral cart. When we say enormous, we don't mean just oversized, we mean absurd. Picture a mobile shrine crossed with a temple on wheels, pulled by 64 mules, each adorned with gold-plated harnesses and intricate embroidery. The cart is roofed, pillared, gilded, and encrusted with precious stones. Alexander, embalmed like a pharaoh, is meant to lie at its heart. This is not a vehicle. It's a statement. The original plan? Take the cart west to Macedonia, Alexander's homeland, where his mother Olympias still broods like a lioness. A burial in Ag, among his ancestors, would satisfy the old guard. But that's not what happens. Because Ptolemy, yes, that Ptolemy, later founder of the Egyptian dynasty, intercepts the cart. Somewhere along the route, probably near Syria, Ptolemy diverts the procession south, toward Egypt. He wants the body, and he gets it. Why? Because he knows that possessing Alexander means inheriting his legacy. If the people of Egypt believe Alexander chose to be buried in their land, then Ptolemy, who positions himself as a kind of stepson of the conqueror, can style himself as the true heir. And it works. Alexander's corpse is brought to Memphis, and later moved to Alexandria, Ptolemy's new capital. There, it becomes a relic, a shrine, a tourist attraction. Even centuries later, Roman emperors like Augustus and Caligula will visit Alexander's tomb. leave offerings, and whisper to the glassy-eyed mummy behind the golden veil. One mainstream historical fact: we still don't know exactly where Alexander's body is today. The tomb in Alexandria was lost, buried under centuries of conquest, flood, and urban sprawl. Its location remains one of the great archaeological mysteries of the ancient world. But back to Babylon. While the funeral cart disappears into Egyptian hands, the empire descends into fever. Perdiccas is furious. He prepares to march on Ptolemy, seeking vengeance for the theft of the royal remains. But before he can reach Egypt, his own men assassinate him in a swampy river crossing. The regent is gone, and with him, any pretense of unity. The wars of the Diadochi have officially begun. And Alexander's body? It becomes the ghost at every feast. Every general who styles himself as a king, Antigonus in Asia, Seleucus in Babylon, Lysimachus in Thrace, must reckon with the fact that they don't have the corpse. Ptolemy does, and that makes him dangerous. Here's a dark little twist for you. There's a legend that Cassander, one of the most brutal of Alexander's successors, once visited the tomb in Alexandria and spat upon the sarcophagus. It may not be true, but it reveals a truth. To these men, Alexander was no longer a god. He was a weapon, a mirror, a memory they had to either embrace or erase. Even centuries later, the myth of Alexander's untouched body lingered. Some Islamic scholars would describe him as a prophet. Medieval Christian texts would confuse him with heroes from the Bible. The idea that his corpse never decayed became a kind of spiritual truth. His body, like his legend, was too large to die properly. And what's most eerie, the man who had reshaped the world never received the thing every common soldier, every peasant, every builder of his roads was granted: a final resting place. Chosen without politics, no burning pyre, no humble grave, just silence, just theft, just a golden coffin glinting under foreign stars. A crown split 13 ways. Babylon, once the heart of empire, now pulses like a fractured artery. With Alexander's body gone and no heir old enough to reign, the question is no longer, who rules, but how many dare try? It turns out the answer is, too many. We call them the Diadochi, Alexander's generals, friends, and opportunists, the successors. There are more than a dozen key players, and none of them are interested in sharing. But initially, they pretend to. A hasty compromise is forged in the partition of Babylon, a tense agreement that slices the empire like a wedding cake. Territories are divvied up. Perdiccas keeps the title of regent, though, as we saw, not for long. Antipater controls Macedonia. Ptolemy gets Egypt. Seleucus is handed Babylon. Lysimachus is tossed Thrace, and others are given satrapies, little provinces to manage. On parchment, it looks like stability. In reality, it's a blood-soaked board game. Historians still argue whether the partition was ever intended to last, or merely a polite way to delay war. Because war comes fast, the ink hasn't dried when factions begin to splinter, alliances shift, and whispers of assassination begin to curl under palace doors like smoke. Let's take a moment here to savor a lesser-known but strangely revealing detail. Eumenes of Cardia. Not a name you hear often outside specialist history books. But he's a fascinating figure, Greek, not Macedonian, and a former secretary to Alexander. Somehow, Eumenes winds up commanding armies against some of Alexander's fiercest generals. Why? Because he dared to stay loyal to the idea of the empire. Eumenes fought not for land, not for gold, but for the unborn son of Alexander, Alexander IV. A child, a symbol. He's like a tragic middle manager trying to hold a collapsing company together while billionaires fight over the branding rights. And of course, loyalty gets you killed. Eumenes is eventually betrayed by his own troops and executed. But we'll return to him later. His death is part of a pattern. Meanwhile, the old guard is dying off. Antipater passes his authority in Macedonia to Polyperchon, snubbing his own son Cassander, who, unsurprisingly, doesn't take this well. Cassander quickly rises to power through military force and political cunning. He is ambitious, ruthless, and, oh yes, the man who will later murder Alexander's widow and child. But not just yet. Back in Egypt, Ptolemy is playing a longer game. While others battle for territory, he builds institutions, forges an administration, welcomes scholars, constructs the early foundations of what will become the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaonic line of Egypt, which ends centuries later with Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. One mainstream historical fact. Ptolemy writes a history of Alexander's campaigns. Most of it is lost, but ancient writers say it became the basis for many later biographies. Meaning, Ptolemy not only stole the body, he tried to steer the story. And while all this is happening, the world forgets Alexander's dream. No one is keeping the empire whole. The roads crack, the satraps rebel, trade routes grow dangerous. The Persian nobility reasserts itself in the east. In India, local kings re-emerge from under Macedonian shadows. In Bactria, Greco-Persian warlords begin building their own hybrid kingdoms. The empire, in effect, exists only on maps. Remember the coin analogy? Each general starts minting his own coins now. Some still bear Alexander's image, but gradually, new faces appear. Antigonus, Lysimachus, Seleucus. A symbolic shift. Power now flows through silver and propaganda. If your face is on the drachma, you exist. And yet, none of these men dare call themselves king. Not yet. That would be too bold. Too obvious a betrayal of Alexander's legacy. Instead, they wear titles like strategos or satrap, as if they're still caretakers of a larger vision. It's all theater, and everyone knows it. Here's a chilling little anecdote. Seleucus, who was once just a minor commander, rises to power in the east, Babylonia and beyond. When his rivals try to remove him, he flees, but returns with an army of elephants. Literal war elephants, secured from India, stomping back into the Fertile Crescent like a thunderstorm on legs. The image sticks. The empire of Alexander now walks on beasts, not dreams. And amid all this chaos, one figure remains eerily quiet. Roxana, the queen, the mother of Alexander's son. She hides in the fortress of Amphipolis, far from the centers of power, raising the child who might someday unite the broken crown, or be killed by it. Because everyone knows, a living heir is a threat. And when threats grow inconvenient in this new world, they tend to vanish. Whispers in the mausoleum. Let's revisit that body. You remember, don't you? The corpse that launched 1,000 schemes? The man who once commanded the winds of empire now rests somewhere cold, still, and suspiciously absent from modern maps. Because here's the thing. After Ptolemy intercepted the body and took it to Egypt, we lose the trail. For a while, sources say Alexander's remains were housed in Memphis, an ancient city near modern Cairo. Lavish tomb, endless tributes, parades of pilgrims. It became a kind of political lighthouse. But later, perhaps decades later, the body was moved again. This time to Alexandria, or so we're told. And this is where the mystery deepens. What happened to Alexander's remains after that? Nobody knows. There are tantalizing ancient accounts. Strabo says he saw the tomb in Alexandria. So does Pausanias. Augustus himself allegedly visited it in 30 BCE, viewed the mummy, and even accidentally broke the nose while placing flowers on it. A deeply awkward moment of imperial tourism. Another Roman emperor, Caligula, supposedly stole Alexander's breastplate from the tomb for his personal collection. Later still, Septimius Severus sealed the site, perhaps for its protection, perhaps to bury something inconvenient. And after that, silence. Gone. A mainstream historical fact. By the time of late antiquity, the exact location of Alexander's tomb had already become uncertain. In a city renowned for its shifting coastlines and devastating earthquakes, even monumental structures could vanish beneath rubble or waves. But here's a lesser-known detail. In 199 AD, a Roman official wrote that the tomb had become a center of quasi-religious devotion. Pilgrims came not only to honor Alexander, but to seek oracles, prophecies, healing. It had become a shrine. And shrines are dangerous things. Because while generals fought over borders, something stranger was happening underground, the transformation of a corpse into a relic. A relic too powerful to be left alone. Historians still argue whether the tomb's disappearance was due to natural disaster, Roman paranoia, or intentional concealment. Maybe it was looted, maybe destroyed by Christian zealots in the 4th century. Maybe it's simply still out there, buried beneath layers of Alexandria's modern sprawl, waiting for the right earthquake or archaeologist. Let's entertain a dark little theory, not a proven fact, but one that's floated by scholars who enjoy a whisper more than a declaration. What if the body that Augustus visited wasn't actually Alexander? Some suggest Ptolemy, eager to cement his rule, may have used a look-alike corpse, embalmed and staged with royal trappings. Others propose that Alexander's true remains were lost early, perhaps even dumped at sea by Perdiccas' men, and the whole tomb was a brilliant, decades-long act of imperial theater. A symbol matters more than a truth, and the man who conquered the known world becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever the current ruler wants to see. Back in Babylon, we started with a deathbed and a disappearing body. Now we find ourselves tangled in a trail of rumors, sealed doors, and missing maps. It feels less like a royal funeral and more like a ghost story. Let's pause on one final unsettling twist. In 2021, a team of researchers proposed that the body of Alexander the Great might have shown signs not of traditional mummification, but of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disease. It's a modern theory, of course, based on symptom descriptions in ancient texts. But if it's even partially accurate, Alexander might have been buried alive, paralyzed, breathing shallowly, misdiagnosed as dead in an era without stethoscopes. That chill you just felt? It's not the AC. There's something uniquely horrifying about the idea of the world's greatest conqueror, trapped in his own body, watching silently as priests anoint him, wrap him, seal him inside gold, and then darkness. Now, dim the lights a little more, because the tomb may be lost. But the story isn't over. The next generation has arrived, and they're sharpening knives, not raising statues. A crown split 17 ways. Imagine this. The most powerful man in the known world is dead, or presumed dead, and there's no will. No clear heir, no designated successor, no living child old enough to rule. Just a pregnant widow. What follows isn't just a scramble for power. It's an unraveling, a slow-motion explosion of trust, alliance, and empire. They call them the Diadochi, the successors. A collection of battle-hardened generals, governors, and family members who had ridden beside Alexander across continents. You'd think these men, forged together by fire and blood, might honor his legacy, hold the empire together. You'd be wrong. Mainstream historical fact. Just days after Alexander's death, his top generals convened in Babylon for what would later be called the Partition of Babylon. They divided the empire like slicing up a massive wedding cake with 17 different knives. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus got Babylon, Antipater, Macedonia, Perdiccas, the regent. He took control of the army and the unborn child of Alexander and Roxana, who was quickly declared the future king. Sounds tidy on paper. In practice, chaos. Because here's the quirky detail. The infant they placed their hopes on, Alexander IV, wasn't even born yet. He was an idea, a placeholder, a convenient excuse for whichever general wanted to rule in his name. And all of them wanted to rule. Historians still argue whether the entire regency was a charade from the beginning, an illusion of unity to buy time until swords were sharpened. If Alexander had named a successor clearly, if he'd pointed to someone, anyone, maybe the empire wouldn't have collapsed into decades of war. But he didn't. Or maybe he did. Some sources suggest that on his deathbed, when asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest." A mic drop from the grave. Because what followed wasn't diplomacy. It was blood. Roxana, now mother to a would-be king, swiftly eliminated Alexander's other wife, Statera, to secure her child's claim. Meanwhile, Perdiccas began ruling in the name of Alexander IV, but conveniently ignored anyone else's opinion. Ptolemy, in Egypt, quickly decided he didn't need Babylon's permission for anything. He had the mummy, remember? Cassander, son of Antipater, began positioning himself in Macedonia. Seleucus eyed the eastern satrapies. Lysimachus took Thrace, each of them, at first allies, then rivals, then open enemies. And so begins the Wars of the Diadochi, a decades-long nightmare of betrayal, siege, and shifting borders. It's as if Alexander's empire were a snow globe, dropped, shattered, and scattered into sparkling, deadly fragments. What's fascinating, and a little tragic, is how each general tried to claim they were defending Alexander's legacy. Even as they trampled it, statues went up, coins were minted with his face. Cities still bore his name. But behind every monument, a blade, a child king, not yet 10 years old, was paraded around like a living talisman. Alexander IV, the boy emperor, became less of a person and more of a chess piece. And all the while, the real legacy of Alexander, the unity, the shared dream of East and West, was being burned from the map. One scroll at a time, one city at a time, one heir at a time. Some empires fade gently, others implode with such noise that even centuries later, you can still hear the echoes. So listen closely. That sound? That's not wind. That's the whisper of men who once called each other brother, now crouched behind stone walls, calculating where to strike next. Because in the absence of a crown, everyone becomes a king. The boy who would be king. If you're quiet, very quiet, you might hear it. The soft rustle of silk wrapping a newborn in the palace at Babylon. A child, barely a day old, blinking up into a world that already wants him dead. Alexander IV. He never knew his father. Never saw the golden armor, the lion-headed helmet, the way crowds bent and cheered. But the moment he wailed into existence, that tiny breath carried the weight of an empire. Mainstream historical fact. Alexander the Great's son, by Roxana, was born shortly after his death in 323 BCE. The child was proclaimed king alongside Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridius, a man described as mentally impaired, possibly due to illness or poisoning. That's right, the new rulers of the greatest empire on earth were a baby and a man barely capable of independent speech. You could call it a power vacuum, or you could call it what it really was, a kill switch. The child was never meant to rule. Not really. He was meant to exist just long enough for someone else to rule in his name. And so he did, for a while. The regent Perdiccas, remember him? Tried to wield authority by propping up the baby king like a royal glove puppet. But that didn't sit well with the other successors. Not for long. Historians still argue whether Perdiccas ever truly intended to protect Alexander IV, or whether the boy was just a useful veil to drape over his own ambition. Either way, Perdiccas didn't last. Within a few short years, he was betrayed and assassinated during a disastrous Egyptian campaign. His own troops turned on him. One of the co-conspirators? Ptolemy. Yes, that Ptolemy, keeper of the corpse. And with that, the boy king passed to another protector. Then another, and another, each one more ruthless, more calculating than the last. Meanwhile, Roxana, the queen mother, vanished into seclusion with her son. It wasn't for safety, it was for strategy, because as long as the boy lived, he was a threat to everyone. Quirky historical detail. Some sources claim Roxana drugged the boy's caretakers, isolating him completely, even limiting his interactions with sunlight or other children, just to make sure he wouldn't be manipulated. Imagine that, growing up with whispers at your bedroom door, guards who change weekly, and a mother who smiles too sweetly while checking your food for poison. Not exactly lullaby material. As time passed, the wars of the Diadochi grew worse. Territories shifted like puzzle pieces in an earthquake. But still, Alexander IV remained a symbol. And symbols are dangerous. Because when you're a child emperor, you don't get to grow up slowly. You grow up in the crosshairs. By the time the boy turned 13, he and Roxana were prisoners, under protection. Of course, in Amphipolis, a northern Greek city far from the palaces of Babylon. Cassander held them there, son of Antipater, a man with no interest in raising kings. He had ambitions of his own. So let's pause here, just for a second. Imagine being that boy. You've never led an army, never worn a crown, but you carry the name, Alexander. And for that alone, you're more dangerous than any sword. Historians still argue whether Cassander ever planned to honor the boy's claim. Whether there was a final moment of hesitation, of decency. But what we do know, around the year 310 BCE, the boy and his mother simply disappeared. There were no trials, no declarations, just a blank space in the records. Later, much later, rumors emerged that Cassander had them both quietly murdered. Poison, perhaps. or starvation. Some say their bodies were buried in secret graves. Others believe their bones still lie beneath Amphipolis. Beneath centuries of silence. The boy who would be king, gone before he ever wore the title. And with him, the last fragile thread tying the fractured empire to its original master. That's the thing about echoes. The loudest ones often come from rooms already emptied. The body in the glass coffin. There's something unsettling about a corpse that travels better than most kings. Something that refuses to rot, to disappear, to surrender to dust. And in the case of Alexander the Great, his corpse doesn't just linger, it moves. After all, this was no ordinary burial. This was a performance. Mainstream historical fact. Alexander's body was reportedly placed in a golden sarcophagus. Inside a casket of honey or some embalming fluid, depending on which ancient account you believe, and displayed publicly for years in the city of Alexandria. Yes, that Alexandria, the city he founded himself. It became his tomb, his shrine, and his silent witness. But let's rewind just a little. Remember how Perdiccas had the body heading to Macedon? Well, Ptolemy changed that plan, dramatically. He hijacked the funeral procession, mid-journey, and redirected the corpse to Egypt. His logic? If you control the remains of a god-king, you control the myth, and maybe the people, too. Historians still argue whether Ptolemy truly cared about Alexander's legacy or simply wanted to weaponize his memory. Maybe both. So what happens next? The body, now a kind of holy relic, becomes the centerpiece of a new Alexandria. It's housed in a magnificent tomb, sometimes called the Soma. Visitors from every corner of the empire come to see it. Quirky historical detail. Roman emperors made pilgrimages to view Alexander's corpse. Julius Caesar allegedly wept at the sight. Caligula may have stolen his breastplate. Augustus ordered flowers laid at his feet. The corpse was basically a celebrity meet and greet, minus the meat. And definitely minus the greet. But the longer the body stayed above ground, the stranger things got. At one point, it was moved again, possibly multiple times. Earthquakes, regime changes, and the decay of records all blurred the line between reverence and confusion. No one could quite agree on the tomb's exact location. By the 3rd century CE, writers still mention seeing the body, still intact, still strangely present. But after that, silence. Poof. Gone. No grand theft, no fiery destruction, just a quiet vanishing act. Some believe the body was destroyed in a riot. Others suggest early Christians, seeking to purge pagan relics, erased the shrine entirely. Or perhaps, and here's where it gets deliciously eerie, perhaps the body was hidden. Some conspiracy-minded historians have proposed that Alexander's body was spirited away beneath Alexandria, sealed in some forgotten catacomb or chamber of the dead. And if you believe that, well, there's a good chance he's still there, waiting. Imagine walking the streets of modern Alexandria, unaware that just beneath your feet lies a gilded tomb and a face that once stared down empires. It's not entirely absurd. In fact, archaeologists have spent centuries hunting for it. Every few decades, someone swears they've found a clue, a strange chamber, a misidentified mummy, a royal artifact. But the truth? The corpse of Alexander the Great is still lost. Possibly stolen, possibly crumbled, possibly watching you through time with embalmed eyes, tucked in honey under a forgotten slab of stone. It's a fitting end, isn't it? The man who conquered the known world, whose ego was carved into geography itself, leaves behind a body that disappears more completely than the cities he burned. And yet, somehow, that absence only makes the myth stronger. Because if there's one thing people fear more than death, it's not knowing what happened after. So the rumors persist. He's buried under the mosque. He was cremated and scattered. He's sleeping beneath a modern hotel, or under a collapsed wall, or waiting for someone foolish enough to dig too deep. And just maybe, he's not really gone. Just ask the old Alexandrians. They'll tell you, on certain quiet nights, when the wind carries the scent of salt and jasmine, you can still hear the shuffle of royal sandals across the stone. Still feel the chill of his shadow brushing past. Still wonder whether the glass coffin, wherever it lies, is finally empty. The whispering tomb. It's strange, isn't it? How a tomb can be louder in silence than in song. Alexandria, once the crown jewel of ancient knowledge and cosmopolitan glory, has swallowed the sound of Alexander's name into its dust. But the whispers? They linger. Let's walk through the city for a moment. Modern Alexandria bustles with life, cars honk, fishermen haul nets at dawn, and the Mediterranean laps lazily at concrete piers. But peel back the centuries, and underneath all this noise lies a different rhythm. Cracked catacombs, collapsed columns, forgotten gods, and somewhere in this tangle, if you believe the oldest tales, sleeps Alexander the Great. Mainstream historical fact: no archaeological team has ever definitively located his tomb. Despite over 2,000 years of searching. Not for lack of trying. In fact, Napoleon's team of scholars thought they were close during his Egyptian campaign. Later, the British got involved. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, major excavations have taken place, always chasing that vanishing ghost. But it's like trying to catch fog in your hands. Quirky historical detail. In 1850, a local Alexandrian guide swore he had found the tomb beneath a carpet shop. The owner didn't seem impressed, too busy making sales. A century later, an amateur historian claimed the body had been moved beneath a mosque, only for the government to shut down the dig after political pressure. Now, here's where things get weird. Some scholars, and we use that term generously, suggest that the tomb was purposefully hidden. Not just lost. That, in fact, it may be sealed behind false walls or down sunken staircases flooded by seawater after centuries of coastal shifts and earthquakes. Historians still argue whether these theories hold any water, figuratively or literally. But you see the allure. Every time someone uncovers a chunk of ancient wall or finds a chamber full of Greco-Roman artifacts, the question arises again: could this be it? And with that question comes another: why does it matter? Here's a man whose bones, if found, would trigger global headlines, whose tomb, if intact, could redefine archaeology. And yet, perhaps it's better we don't find him. Because a whisper is more powerful than a shout. Because a mystery breeds more devotion than a solved equation. And because Alexander's story has always been a little too big to fit neatly into stone. Still, let's entertain a thought. What if someone does find it? Say, deep beneath the modern city, buried under libraries and mosques and homes, there lies a chamber of gilded marble, torches mounted in lion-headed sconces, a sarcophagus lined with gold, and within it, the emperor himself, preserved like a warning. You'd think it would answer questions. But it wouldn't. It would only raise more. Was he poisoned or not? Did his generals manipulate the embalming process? Is the tomb a symbol of glory or of betrayal? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did the world forget it? Why did this most magnificent resting place fall into obscurity? Some believe it was the rise of Christianity. That early church leaders, in their campaign to stamp out pagan relics, erased all memory of the tomb on purpose. A clean slate for a new world. Others suggest that the body was moved again, quietly, perhaps even by royal decree, to avoid desecration. Or that time simply did what time does: grind down even the most eternal things into silence. But Alexandria remembers, in its bones, in its whispers, and when you walk its streets after midnight, when the traffic thins and the breeze stiffens off the sea, you might pass a crumbling wall or a gated alleyway and feel something. A pressure, a presence, a pause. It's nothing, of course. Just the city breathing. Just the echoes of sandals on stone. Just a tomb that isn't there, but also never really left. The body that wouldn't rot. Picture this. A king dies. His empire is fractured. His generals squabble over maps and titles. And yet, weeks pass, and his corpse? It doesn't decay. That's not a story from a church saint's hagiography. That's Alexander the Great. According to multiple ancient sources, some more breathless than others, Alexander's body showed no sign of decomposition for 6 full days after death. In a climate like Babylon's, in the summer. Mainstream historical fact: both Plutarch and Arrian, writing centuries later, mention this detail. In particular, they note that the embalmers were stunned to find the body seemingly untouched by decay. The implication? Divine status. Even in death, Alexander refused to behave like a mere mortal. Now, let's pause and let that settle. No bloating, no stench, no discoloration, Just a pristine corpse lying in a golden sarcophagus. Sounds impossible? Historians still argue whether this was a literal event or a clever bit of postmortem PR. After all, Alexander had spent his whole career blurring the line between man and God. His death was no time to abandon the brand. But here's where things turn from miraculous to suspicious. A few modern researchers have raised an eyebrow at the description, not because they believe it, but because it matches certain symptoms of poisoning. Specifically, certain plant-based poisons known to ancient Persians and Egyptians can cause paralysis and coma-like states that mimic death. One in particular, veratrum album, or white hellebore, has been floated as a candidate. It slows the heart, causes muscular rigidity, and can leave a body cool to the touch but technically alive. Lesser-known detail? White hellebore was used medicinally to induce vomiting. But in large doses, it could kill, slowly. Which leads us to the chilling idea, was Alexander buried alive? Now, we're not saying he clawed at the inside of his sarcophagus. This isn't a mummy movie. But it does raise the haunting possibility that his attendants, in their rush to preserve his body, or claim his power, may have embalmed a man who wasn't quite dead. The ancient accounts don't help. One says he was speechless and immobile for over a day before death was declared. Another says he continued to show signs of breath, but no pulse could be found. Of course, pulse, in 323 BC was not exactly measured with modern precision. It's entirely possible the people surrounding Alexander at the end weren't sure if he was dead, but wanted him to be. Because dead men don't give orders. And the longer Alexander lingered on the threshold between life and death, the more nervous his generals became. Think of it this way. You're a powerful warlord standing at the bedside of the most legendary man alive. His empire is ripe for plundering. His son is still unborn. His will? Possibly forge. His enemies? Watching closely. Would you wait, or would you help things along? Even Plutarch suggests that no one dared to touch Alexander's body until they were certain he had passed. That delay, those precious hours, may have allowed for the body to settle, stiffen, and appear miraculously preserved. And once that narrative began, it was too good to stop. A body that doesn't rot? That's not a symptom. It's a sign, a divine endorsement, proof that this man, this conqueror, had truly ascended beyond the reach of time and worms. But if we peel back the reverence, the perfume, the ceremonial veils, we're left with something simpler, and far more unsettling. A corpse that was either expertly preserved, or not a corpse at all. Either way, the symbolism was clear. In a world built on omens, Alexander's undecaying body became a message. The empire may splinter, but his presence endures. His generals may argue, but none dare bury him outright. His legacy may drift, but his flesh, for now, remains. Of course, the preservation didn't last. At some point, embalming took over. The body was sealed in a golden sarcophagus, paraded, fought over, displayed. But that initial moment, those 6 impossible days, remains a splinter in the story. A hiccup in the clean narrative. Too unnatural to ignore, too powerful to deny. And whether it was divine will, medical anomaly, or something far darker, it cast a long shadow over every decision that followed. So next time you hear about saints whose bodies resist decay, or emperors whose corpses glow faintly beneath the tomb, remember that Alexander did it first. Or so they say. The funeral that never happened. By now, most great rulers would be entombed, mourned, and remembered with ceremony. But Alexander's death gave no such closure. In fact, if you were expecting a stately funeral in Babylon, think again. Because it never happened. Mainstream historical fact. Alexander the Great never received a proper funeral in the city where he died. Despite the grandeur of his passing and the wealth at the empire's disposal, his body would begin a strange, meandering journey that reads more like a treasure heist than a royal farewell. Let's rewind. After the initial shock of his death wore off, Alexander's generals had a logistical nightmare on their hands. Who would take the throne? What should be done with the body? And more urgently, how could they stop the power vacuum from devouring the empire? In theory, Alexander had an unborn heir, Roxana was pregnant, and a half-brother with some claim to the throne. But neither was a safe bet in the eyes of the powerful men now circling like vultures. The body, meanwhile, became a pawn. Tradition held that Macedonian kings were buried in the royal tombs at Ag. Yet Babylon had its own spiritual gravity. And Egypt, recently conquered, offered sacred associations with immortality. So the debate began. Where would the king rest? Enter the first oddity. A lesser-known detail. Embalmers worked on Alexander's corpse for months. Ancient sources describe elaborate preparations, including encasing the body in honey, coating it with aromatic resins, and sealing it within a golden anthropoid sarcophagus, likely custom-made to resemble him. It was a relic with legs, and it was going on tour. Historians still argue whether the decision to not bury him immediately was political stalling, logistical chaos, or calculated symbolism. Perhaps they didn't want to bury him until they'd buried the empire. In any case, Babylon saw no royal funeral. Instead, a massive funerary cart was constructed, a wheeled mausoleum, more ornate than most temples, with golden lions, gilded columns, and purple-draped canopies. According to Diodorus, it took 2 years to complete. Then, somewhere between ceremony and spectacle, the cart departed. Where was it going? Officially, to Macedonia. That's where Perdiccas, Alexander's regent, said it should be sent. But Ptolemy, one of Alexander's oldest companions and soon-to-be ruler of Egypt, had other plans. And here's where the story takes a sharp turn. While the funeral caravan was en route, Ptolemy launched an ambush. Yes, he literally hijacked Alexander's corpse. Somewhere near Syria or Damascus, depending on the source. He intercepted the procession and redirected it south, into Egypt. Why? Because whoever held the body held a claim to Alexander's legacy. And Ptolemy, the ever-pragmatic opportunist, understood that dead kings often crown the living. What followed was a masterclass in political theater. Ptolemy buried Alexander, sort of, in Memphis, Egypt's capital at the time, and established a cult around his remains. Priests were appointed, shrines were erected, pilgrimages began. Alexander became more than a memory, he became a presence. No mourning wails in Babylon. No sacred tomb in Ag. Instead, a half-funeral, mid-theft, in a foreign land. It's like if George Washington had died in New York, but his corpse got stolen by a rival general and buried under a McDonald's in Texas. You can almost hear Perdiccas grinding his teeth. But Ptolemy's move worked. By anchoring Alexander's remains in Egypt, he tied himself to the mythos of the man. It gave his rule a sanctified glow, less rebellion, more inheritance, and it set a precedent. Over the next century, Alexander's body would be moved again, possibly displayed, possibly sealed away, but never truly buried in peace. Because he was never just a man. He was a symbol, and symbols, like relics, rarely get to rest. There's something inherently eerie about that. How the most powerful man in the world couldn't secure the most basic human right, a proper burial. That his death sparked a scramble for ownership rather than mourning. That his body became a prize, a trophy, a bargaining chip. It's as if history couldn't let him go. And so, instead of solemn silence, his passing became a parade. Instead of tombstone epitaphs, he got rumors, shrines, and thefts. And somewhere, beneath all that gilded noise, lies a lingering question. If a king's funeral is stolen, did he ever really die? The body in the wrong tomb. It should have ended there, one man's body, resting in Memphis, mythologized by priests and surrounded by incense. But, like everything else in Alexander's legacy, even his remains refused to stay put. What followed was a century of whispered relocations, subtle usurpations, and a tomb that moved more than most people do in a lifetime. Mainstream historical fact: Alexander's body was later moved from Memphis to Alexandria, the shining coastal city he had founded. Though whether he approved of this, well, death doesn't give you a say. It was Ptolemy II, or possibly Ptolemy Soter himself, who ordered the relocation. Alexandria, after all, was now the heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom, a city of gleaming marble, mathematicians, and one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world. And what better way to sanctify your city than to house a god? Yes, by this point, Alexander was officially a god, not metaphorically, not poetically. There were temples, sacrifices, state cults. He had joined the pantheon like a celebrity added to Mount Olympus by popular demand. But the mystery begins here. Lesser-known detail. The exact location of Alexander's tomb in Alexandria has never been found. And that's not just some dusty archaeologist complaint, it's one of history's most perplexing blind spots. Imagine the world losing the burial place of Julius Caesar or Napoleon. It would be unthinkable, and yet, somehow, the tomb of the man who conquered half the known world has vanished. Ancient writers describe it in enough detail to be tantalizing. Strabo, visiting in the 1st century BCE, claimed he saw the tomb in the Soma district, an area in the heart of Alexandria. It was supposedly a grand mausoleum, surrounded by colonnades, encased in translucent glass, or crystal, or gold, depending on who you believe. Even Augustus, yes, that Augustus, visited the tomb, laid flowers, and reportedly kissed the corpse's forehead. We all grieve in our own way. Historians still argue whether this was respect, propaganda, or both. Over the centuries, Alexander's tomb became a sort of macabre tourist attraction. Emperors made pilgrimages to see it. Julius Caesar may have wept in its shadow. Septimius Severus ordered it sealed. Caracalla left lavish offerings, or perhaps looted it. Reports conflict, as they so often do in these tales. Then, sometime between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, the trail goes cold. Alexandria was racked by earthquakes, riots, religious upheaval, pagan shrines fell, Christian churches rose, Muslim conquests reshaped the landscape, and the tomb vanished, like a candle blown out in a storm. Some scholars believe it was deliberately destroyed. Others suspect it lies beneath modern Alexandria, buried under layers of concrete. Traffic and time. A few argue it was moved again, spirited away by those who feared it would be desecrated. There are even wild claims it lies under the Mosque of Nabi Daniel or beneath some sealed vault under sand. But no one knows. And here's the part that sticks in the ribs. We might never know. Imagine how surreal that is. You can visit Tutankhamun's tomb. You can walk the steps of the Colosseum. You can see the footprints on the moon. But you cannot visit the grave of Alexander the Great. It's almost poetic. He lived a life of constant motion. And even in death, he keeps moving, through myth, through history, through rumor. His body has become the world's most famous missing person case. And maybe that's fitting, because the finality of a tomb would close the story. It would mark the end. And Alexander, ambitious, restless, insatiable, was never meant to end. So now, we're left with echoes. Roman emperors standing over crystal coffins. Earthquakes cracking open temple floors. Scholars dusting fragments in seaside cities. And somewhere, maybe under a modern street or a forgotten mosque, the body of a god sleeps soundlessly. Or maybe not. Maybe it's long gone, reduced to ash, washed away by flood or flame. But that, too, is part of the myth, part of the gravity. We search because we believe he should be found. That his story demands an ending. But if history has taught us anything, it's this: not all kings get endings. Some become legends, some become ghosts, and some are buried in the wrong tomb, if they're buried at all. The living God and the dead city. The irony of immortality is that it never quite lasts. Even gods need worshippers, and cities, no matter how grand, have a habit of crumbling. By now, centuries have passed since Alexander drew his last breath, and the world that once trembled beneath his sandals has reshaped itself again and again, grinding empires into dust. But even now, echoes remain. Let's walk the streets of Alexandria, what's left of them. The modern city, bustling and humid, sits atop ancient foundations. Cars honk where once chariots clattered. Vendors hawk kebabs and cold drinks where philosophers once debated the nature of the soul. But beneath the pavement, somewhere deep below layers of conquest and concrete, the heartbeat of a vanished world still thrums faintly. Mainstream historical fact: Alexandria, after centuries of prominence as a center of learning and culture, declined significantly after repeated invasions and disasters, especially the Arab conquest in the 7th century and later earthquakes in the medieval period. But it was not just nature that eroded it. Religion, politics, power, they all took turns reshaping the city. The Great Library, That fabled beacon of knowledge Alexander never lived to see completed. Vanished piece by piece, sacked and burned by conquerors who found books less useful than swords. And still, the myth of Alexander persisted. Lesser-known detail. Even in Islamic texts, Alexander appears, sometimes as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous ruler who travels to the edges of the earth. That image, part warrior, part prophet, blends historical memory with religious myth, stretching his shadow across yet another cultural landscape. His body may be gone, but Alexander remains undead in the most literal historical sense. Coins bear his face centuries after his death. Monarchs style themselves in his mold. Napoleon carried a copy of the Anabasis to Egypt. Mussolini compared himself to Alexander. Even Hollywood keeps resurrecting him. Bronzed and brooding, swinging his sword across digital battlefields. Historians still argue whether this posthumous worship is legacy or delusion. But here's the strange thing. We don't really remember Alexander for his politics. Or even for his cruelty, which was considerable. Remember when he destroyed Thebes? Or executed his best friend during a drunken rage? Yeah, not exactly bedtime story material. No, what we remember is scale. The sheer audacity, the cosmic ambition, the idea that one man could stretch his will from Greece to India, reshape entire cultures, and then die, young, beautiful, burning, with his dreams still unfinished. It's operatic, it's tragic, it's irresistible, and that's why the city matters. Because Alexandria wasn't just a city, it was a monument to that ambition, built on a vision, drawn with a ruler in the sand, gifted his name, and meant to last forever. A living map of one man's desire to outlive mortality. And maybe that's the most human part of all this. The desire not just to conquer the world, but to leave behind something that proves you existed. A city, a tomb, a story. But we've lost the tomb. The city's bones are buried. And the stories? Well, they change every time we tell them. Still, there are moments, fleeting, electric, when the past presses close. A diver surfaces off the Alexandrian coast holding a broken statue. A fragment of Greek marble pokes out from a demolished building's foundation. A tourist visits the mosque of Nabi Daniel and whispers, maybe, just maybe, even now, search teams are drilling under modern Alexandria, hoping for that jackpot, a gold chamber, a Macedonian sarcophagus, a whisper of history trapped in stone. And when they dig, when they kneel over the ancient dust, brush it gently with gloved fingers, they are not just searching for bones. They are trying to bridge the living to the dead, to touch a myth, to prove that the man who tried to become a god once walked this earth like the rest of us. Here's a quirky little footnote to all this. Every few decades, some headline pops up. Has Alexander's tomb been found? It sparks excitement, debates, articles, documentaries, and then, silence, false alarm, wrong bones, misdated artifacts. And still, the search continues. Because to stop would feel like betrayal. Because deep down, we want Alexander to matter. To still be somewhere, waiting. Not just because he changed the world, but because he refused to be erased from it. Maybe his tomb isn't in Alexandria. Maybe it never made it there. Maybe it was lost at sea, or ground to powder by time. But you and I are here, right now, telling his story, imagining the glint of sunlight on a golden coffin, wondering if that body Augustus kissed really was Alexander. And in that wondering, he survives. The living God, the dead city, the undying question, the deathless debate. There's something poetic, almost irritatingly so, about how the man who built an empire in his 20s, who named cities after himself like a child stamping flags into sandcastles, who tore through Persia like it was soft parchment, should end like this. Not with a bang, not even with a clean wound, but with silence, confusion, and a body no one can quite find. Mainstream historical fact. The precise cause of Alexander the Great's death remains unknown. Ancient sources vary wildly, citing fever, poisoning, exhaustion, grief, and even supernatural causes. And with that ambiguity, the myth metastasized. Let's sit with the options. There's the fever theory, straightforward, clinical, boring even. Malaria or typhoid, take your pick. Babylon. After all, was a marshy breeding ground for all sorts of delightful microbial assassins. A man in his physical prime, constantly exposed to elements and foreign lands, collapses after days of rising temperature and dies. Simple, probable, entirely unsatisfying. Then comes the poison hypothesis. Sexier, shadowy. It's the kind of death worthy of a conqueror turned target. Whispers of revenge from the sons of Persia. Enemies within his own court. A vial slipped into his wine, maybe something slow burning. Like hellebore or arsenic. Pliny and Justin flirt with the idea, and later historians run with it. But here's the catch. Ancient poisons weren't subtle. They burned. They convulsed. And Alexander reportedly spent days in conscious agony, gradually losing the ability to speak, but not writhing or foaming. Not the kind of death poisons of that era usually delivered. At least, not the kinds we know about. Which is exactly what makes the theory stick. Historians still argue whether this was a naturally slow death or an intentionally slow one. If you were going to kill a god king without making it obvious, wouldn't you want it to look vague? Another camp points to Guillain-Barré syndrome, a modern medical diagnosis retroactively applied to an ancient corpse. It's a rare autoimmune disorder that can cause paralysis, fever, and yes, death. In this theory, Alexander's mind remained awake while his body shut down. He may have been alive even as his followers embalmed him. Let that sink in. That famous tale, that his corpse showed no signs of decay for days, becomes less divine miracle and more medical horror story. Buried alive, unblinking in the dark. But we don't just argue about how he died. We argue about why. A quirky, lesser-known debate centers around omens. Alexander believed in them. Birds flying east? Good. Bad dreams? Cancel the campaign. Before his death, we're told his health began failing after a series of ominous signs. A man spontaneously crowned himself king in Alexander's own throne room. A strange bird of ill omen perched on the palace walls. A lion bit one of his companions during a hunt. All harmless on their own. Together, a bad spell tightening. One account even claims that a sea monster rose from the Euphrates the night before he fell ill. Which, okay, probably not. But that's the beauty of legends. They don't have to be true to endure. And endure they have. Modern biographers keep trying to pin him down. Oliver Stone gave him a film. Mary Renaud gave him romance. Historians give him pages and pages, circling the same central mystery. What broke the unbreakable? Was it ambition? He drank. He grieved. He demanded the impossible from his body and his men. Maybe he simply burned out. Like a supernova. Brilliant and brief. Or maybe, just maybe, his death was the beginning of something bigger. Because the moment Alexander died, the myth was born. His generals fought over his body like hyenas over a fallen lion. His supposed final words, to the strongest, sounded more like a challenge than a will. His empire fractured into wars that reshaped the ancient world. His name echoed from Europe to India, through crusades, through classrooms, through bedtime stories about destiny and downfall. And that's where we find ourselves tonight. Not in Babylon, not in Egypt, but here, in the dark space between certainty and speculation. No one knows where he's buried. No one knows what killed him. But he is dead, right? Unless he's just waiting. Like Arthur beneath the hills. Like the emperor asleep in his tomb, waiting for someone to call him back into legend. That's the cruel magic of ambiguity. It doesn't fade, it festers. And when it involves a man who refused to be forgotten, it spreads like wildfire. So we circle the flame. We study the bones we don't have. We tell and retell the story. Adjusting the lighting, angling the camera, changing the mood. We make YouTube videos in the night, whispering through the past, hoping someone's listening. We are all part of the funeral procession now. Centuries late, but faithful nonetheless. Carrying the memory of a man who died too young, or perhaps too perfectly, to be believed. And in the end, maybe that's what he wanted. Not peace, not even glory, but to be remembered. And that, dear listener, is exactly what he got. So, we've come to the end of the journey, not just through the life and death of Alexander the Great, but through the tangled web of stories left in his wake. Let's pause here. Let the dust settle. Let the torches burn low. Imagine that quiet Babylonian room again. The fevered breath, the still body, The hush of watching men who were once conquerors, now just frightened onlookers, the heavy scent of incense, mingled with dread, and the silence that followed, like the breath before history exhales. Whatever truly happened to Alexander, it's buried now, beneath layers of speculation, ambition, ancient politics, and, maybe even beneath the sands of Egypt. But the questions remain. And the beauty of this tale, the reason it echoes through time, isn't in its neatness, but in its discomfort, that we don't know, that we can't know, that something so world-altering could end so messily, so mysteriously, is what keeps us circling back. Maybe you feel that too. A strange restlessness, a quiet awe, a whisper of something ancient pressing at the edges of your thoughts. That's the echo, the one that lingers. So now, as the story fades and your room returns to silence, remember, history doesn't always give us closure. Sometimes, it just leaves the door slightly open. And with that, rest easy. Let the ghosts of kings and fallen empires drift quietly past your window. Let the questions stay unanswered for tonight. You've earned your sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.